Watching this video. So this is going to be a video about firewalls. It's going to be pretty much all theory. We're going to talk about the differences in firewalls between the types, and then kind of where firewalls started and then where they got to where they are today, which is like, what is a next generation firewall? What makes a next generation firewall next generation? And so this is going to be real short, and we're just going to quickly walk through some theory and talk about firewalls. All right, so let's dive in. What is a firewall? So in essence, a firewall can be physical, it can be virtual. In its simplest definition, it is essentially a computer system that is designed to inspect content and block unauthorized access by enforcing policy against this content. And so just some quick examples I can think of, right? So every Microsoft computer, right? Think of your computer with Windows 10, or whether it be a Windows 7 computer, like pretty much every Microsoft computer operating system has come with a built-in application firewall. Your home routers all have built-in firewalls, and usually they're blocking all incoming traffic. So essentially, if you have a wireless home router that you just set up out of the box and maybe you created a Wi-Fi password, that is actually most likely acting as a firewall, and it's blocking all incoming traffic, but it's allowing all outgoing traffic. And so if you really think about it, almost everything you do on the internet, right, goes through a firewall. So, firewall functions. So what can a firewall do? Well, and this is where things get kind of interesting and where the terminology can get kind of mixed. So a firewall can be a lot of different things at once, or it can be, any number of these things, any combination, right? So it can act as a intrusion detection system, intrusion prevention. It can be a DLP. It can be a proxy server, a VPN gateway, a DHCP server, and much, much more. And once again, this is in no real order. And there's a lot more that a firewall can be, and so that's why we're going to talk about the term firewall and kind of how to address it. So firewall or security appliance. So in the real world, when a lot of people talk about firewalls, they're really just talking about like a security appliance, right? And so a modern firewall really isn't just a firewall. It's a lot more than that. And that's kind of what we just saw in that previous slide. It can be any number of things. And so what you'll hear me say a lot is firewall, obviously. But in reality, I'm really more talking about a firewall as like a security appliance. Because it's really just more than a firewall at this point. Or most, I should say, next-gen firewalls, which we're going to be getting into, they're a lot more than just a firewall. So what are the types of firewalls? So in the very beginning here, we had what's called a packet filtering firewall. And so this really only inspects the source and the destination IP address and the source and destination port. So it really only operates at layer 4 of the OSI model. And that was the most basic type of firewall. The next type of firewall we have would be like a proxy firewall. And even these kind of terms and types of firewalls can kind of blend together. But in essence, a proxy firewall would act as kind of like a buffer between clients and servers. It stands between the connections, and it can like monitor and restrict content. And that's kind of it in its most basic form. And then we get to a stateful inspection firewall. So this is a firewall that has what's called a session table, and it will monitor active sessions to help determine what is allowed. We're actually going to go more into this in the next slide. We're going to go a lot deeper. And then lastly, we get to what we have today, which is the next generation firewall. So these firewalls have what's called deep packet inspection, and this means that the firewall is going beyond layer 4 of the OSI model. It's going to actually inspect the payload and try to find or identify applications, identify malicious content or anything that it can, and try to use that as an additional criteria when it's matching via a policy. All right, so non-stateful versus stateful. So some of the first generations of firewalls were packet filtering firewalls, right? And that's kind of what we just talked about. These operate really only at the layer 4 of the OSI model. They were not stateful. And so what that means is you have to account for the firewall not being stateful in your policy. And my example for this would be, let's say you allow traffic from your internal network to communicate out on port 80. So you're allowing your internal users to talk to web servers on the internet over port 80. And so you have a rule that allows these internal users to talk to external traffic, right, to go out to the internet. But you also have to then create a policy that allows the return traffic, so the server or the traffic from the servers back to your internal clients. And you have to create a policy for that as well, because your firewall is not stateful. And so that's essentially what that means, is your firewall can't keep track of who's going out and who's then coming back in. It's only just reading, or it's only essentially taking in this traffic and analyzing it as it hits the interface. So you have to do a little bit more planning and thinking for it. And so with a stateful firewall, you would only need to create the policy allowing your traffic out, because a stateful firewall has a little bit more logic, and it has something called a session table, where it would say, hey, we just allowed this traffic from this user outside, and now this server that this user was communicating with has a bunch of traffic that it wants to send back to our client. And we know that that client has already opened up a session with that server, so we're going to allow that traffic back in, right? And that's a stateful firewall. All right, so what is the next generation firewall? Finally, we're getting to the very end of this list of firewalls. So earlier generations of firewalls only operated at OSI layer 4. And so once again, what that meant was we inspected the IP addresses, we inspected the ports. And so if those two criteria were met, there would be a match and the traffic would get to move on to its destination, right? And so the firewall had no understanding of anything beyond that. So as long as the traffic, once again, passed through that source, destination, and protocol and port, it would get allowed. And now here's the big difference. The next generation firewall operates and identifies traffic all the way up to layer 7 of the OSI model. So what does that mean? So that means that the firewall is now looking at the payload of the packet, and it's actually taking a deep dive into each packet and trying to identify things like applications, and if it can identify the application, what kind of application is it? Or is what we see in the payload, does it match some sort of malicious virus signature or malicious software, or spyware or whatever? Or maybe the user is browsing the web, and this firewall is also set up to act as like a URL or content filtering. So maybe the user is going to a site that they shouldn't be going to, or they're not allowed to go to. So this really turns the firewall into this real big all-in-one security appliance where it can do a lot more than just like the traditional packet filtering, right? And so that's where next generation firewalls come into the picture. So why does this matter? And this is my favorite picture here of like a hacker. I think it's true that all hackers actually have to wear ski masks. So why does this matter? So imagine if a bad guy, the hacker here with the ski mask, wants to send some malicious traffic with malicious payload into your network. Well, with a traditional firewall, if this traffic fits your policy, it gets in, right? So if this traffic is sent over the correct port and the right destination, it's allowed to communicate to your internal network. It doesn't matter what's in the payload because the firewall is not looking out for that. And so with the next generation firewall, this all changes, right? So the firewall now has, once again, what's called deep packet inspection. The firewall can act as an IPS, an IDS. It can actually analyze the payload of the traffic and look for patterns that it finds malicious. And then based on what it finds, it could potentially alert, it could block, or it could like reset the connection, or it could perform any number of those steps. And so that's kind of the bread and butter behind the next generation firewall. All right, and lastly, Firewall Brands. So just to name them off in no particular order, this isn't any sort of special list. Just kind of thought of some main ones off the top of my head. But there are a lot of next generation firewall vendors and brands, right, that exist out there. And so these are just some of the more popular ones, right? So Cisco has a next generation firewall, Juniper, ForcePoint, Palo Alto Networks, Sophos, Fortinet, Checkpoint, Barracuda, and SonicWall, and there's a lot more than that. But these are just some of the next generation firewall brands. And if you move on to part 2 of this, which is going to be released shortly, I'm probably going to talk more about Palo Alto Networks because that's where a lot of my experience comes from.